please use the Q&A button and we'll get to them at the end of the program as time allows. You can also leave comments at any time using the chat function. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend just leaving and re-entering the room via the Zoom link. Using headphones will often resolve any sound issues that you might be having. We would like to remind you also that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone present, and we ask that you be respectful of everyone who's joined us tonight. Offensive or inappropriate comments will see the user dismissed from this space. This collectively that we're in is a virtual space, but I'm speaking to you tonight from Seattle, Washington, a city built on the homeland of the Duwamish people, in fact, named after one of those people. The Duwamish are still present and still seeking federal recognition, an effort you can learn more about at realrentduwamish.org, a link that we will probably also drop in the chat later. But let me introduce you to our guest this evening. First off, Paul Yoon is the author of two story collections, Once the Shore, which was a New York Times notable book, and The Mountain, which was an NPR Best Book of the Year. His novel Snow Hunters won the Young Lions Fiction Award. A recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars and the National Endowment for the Arts. He lives in Sanford, Florida with his wife, the fiction writer Laura Vandenberg, and their dog, Oscar. Ethan Rutherford's fiction has appeared in Bomb, Tin House, Plowshares, One Story, American Short Fiction, Post Road, Aesopus, Conjunctions, and the Best American Short Stories anthology. His first book, The Peripatetic Coffin and Other Stories, which has a great name, was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, a finalist for the John Leonard Award, received honorable mention for the Penn Hemingway Award, was a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection, and was the winner of a Minnesota Book Award. Born and raised in Seattle, Washington, in fact, right here in the Madison Park neighborhood, where our store is located, he received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Minnesota and now teaches creative writing at Trinity College. He lives in Hartford, Connecticut with his wife and two children. I'm very much looking forward to listening to tonight's discussion about Ethan's captivating and disconcerting short stories and whatever else comes up. I will be back later to share your comments and questions with our authors, but for now, take it away, gentlemen.
All right, here we go. Paul, it's great to see you. James, thank you so much.
Great to see you, buddy.
Good to see you. So, listen, I'm so pleased to be here today. And it's so strange. I can't see anyone, but I know that you're all here.
But you can see me.
I can see you, and you could just, we can pretend that there's a lot of people here. But thank you for coming. It really means a lot. My last book launch in Seattle, all of my elementary school teachers came, all of my old friends were there, and it was the best feeling in the world. And so I'm really thrilled to do this again in this year of great stress. It doesn't really sort of seem to end, but maybe we're going to turn the corner on it in the Zoom room of the mind. My friend Paul is here. We're going to talk a little bit later, and he's going to make sort of like really approving faces through the first part of this, so that we're going to sort of have some wonderful questions and talk. I'm going to tell you about the book. I'm going to read a little bit, and then we're just going to sort of open up the throttle, and you can embarrass us in the chat. You can ask us any questions you want. But first, before we sort of get into all of that, I really wanted to thank the 3 bookstores who are putting on this event. Paulina Springs in Sisters, Oregon, the Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, and Madison Books in Seattle. It means the world to me to launch this in the Pacific Northwest. It's my home. And Madison Books is like 3 blocks from where I grew up. My mom was just in the store today talking to James. And James is the manager of that shop. And so I feel as home as can be right now, and it means a lot. So thank you to these bookstores, and please, guys, please support these independent bookstores. They're amazing. They'll be putting up links in the chat where you can buy books. And even if you don't feel like buying our books, although I can't imagine why you wouldn't buy our books, please buy a book from them. And Paul and I will have other recommendations. I'll recommend Paul's books, he'll recommend other people's books. But please, please support your independent bookstores, and these guys in particular, by buying a book, even if you already have all of our books here. Okay, so my new book, Farthest South. It's my second collection, and it was published on Tuesday by A Strange Object. It has a beautiful cover designed by our great friend, Nyan Cho, and it's illustrated. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these stories, and then show you something, and then I'll read very quickly, and then Paul and I will sort of get down to it. One of the things that makes this collection different from my earlier collection, although you heard James sort of go like, and there are sort of disorienting and kind of alarming stories. That's sort of my wheelhouse. Everyone's a little bit like, oh, this seems great. And they're like, oh, that's really scary. But the difference is that I wrote these stories when I was a young parent myself. And all of these stories, though they're very far-flung, they're all to some degree about the anxiety and fear and joy and tenderness that comes from raising young children and trying to make a family in the world. And the origin story here for a lot of the pieces in this book, it was simply that I was spending a lot of time reading or telling stories to my kids in that sort of fever zone where you have sleepless nights and you're sort of uncertain about nearly everything, and what my role was as a parent and what it should be. But what I realized what I was doing as I was telling these stories, I was trying to find a language both to prepare them for the difficult world, but also trying to offer them some degree of comfort. Some wonderful marketing genius thought of these stories and as sort of bedtime stories for the end of the world. And I think that's right. I like that. They're bedtime stories that are to some degree about the end of the world. I also think that all of them kind of come from that fever dream of young parenthood. So each of the stories in here, they engage with the act of storytelling. They're framed stories, and they pull in tropes from the ghost stories, from fables, from Arctic exploration, the Salem witch trials, and they engage with the looming threat of climate change, but in a really good, funny way that you're going to want to tell everybody about. But the impulse here for all these stories is, it's just, let me tell you a story. And so in each, the domestic sphere, the family zone, is pushed up against sort of the sphere of darker forces. So there's 9 stories in here, and all of them sort of push in strange directions. They're also, to some degree, fever dreams themselves, and they include sea monsters and voyages. There's a baby who's born with gills. But it seems important to say that the threads that connect the stories aren't all scary, bleak, or supernatural, though that's present. But they're linked by the presence and importance of family. It's a book about love, or at least that was the intention. So I wanted to show you guys something like really quickly. I just had a wonderful time talking to James about bookselling. I was a bookseller for years. I worked for 3 Lives in New York. And one of the things that I was really hoping to do with this collection is sort of make a book as an object. And when I was talking to Jill Myers, who's the editor of Strange Object, we were talking about the ways in which we can make that happen. The books that I remember loving in a bookstore, they were always the books that were sort of your secret books, and you would just kind of pull them out and go. And the book that I remember doing that book, just forcing these books on people, it was the collected works of Billy the Kid by Michael Andache. And what I always loved about that book was that it incorporated pictures and illustrations in fragments. And so we asked an artist named Anders Nelson, whose work I completely adore. He has a graphic novel called Tongues. He's also the author of the book Rage of Poseidon, which is another graphic novel that I really love. If you'd be interested in maybe sort of offering some illustrations, and I'm just going to share some of the illustrations that appear in this book, because it's the coolest part of this book. It was the happiest sort of surprise about the production of this book. So here we go, off into screen sharing land, which always takes me about a million years. But you can see this. Paul, can you see this? Just nod if you can see these pictures. So listen, I'm just going to show you these sort of very quickly, but these are the pictures that Anders came up with. We just sent him the manuscript and said, draw something that you think sort of is evocative. And he came up with these like wonderful images that for me kind of make the book that I always wanted it to be. The books that I remember when I was a kid, they all had illustrations. And I'm thinking of like Treasure Island with the N.C. Wyeth illustrations in particular. And you would just sort of sit there and look at the illustrations, and it became sort of like another intelligence going through the book. And so this is an illustration that comes from the story Angus and Annabelle. This next one is from Fable, which is great. And you can sort of see like, oh yeah, all right, now we're in sort of like the land of wilderness with a wolf in a cave. He also came up with these like really wonderful, we were hoping to find kind of illustrations to just sort of break up the text and to sort of like offer breaths over the course of the reading experience. And so we also came up with these like really wonderful illustrations that Jill just sort of put wonderfully in the middle of the stories. So this is from Ghost Story. This is from Holiday, where sort of a scary moment where someone's hand covers someone else's hand at the table. This is from Ghost Story, and I think this one is just unbelievably beautiful. And the experience for me of seeing these illustrations was really astonishing. That as a writer, I frequently write to images. I cut out images like I'm going to be writing ransom letters, and I put them on the wall and I write towards them, and that helps me sort of begin writing, but it's always writing towards the image, then you just sort of let the image go. The thing about this is that Anders gave us these images and then based off of the text. And then once I saw them, it felt to me in this sort of weird inversion that actually the stories had been written to the illustrations. And I'm just really pleased and happy that the book came out this way. And I'd like to thank like Deep Vellum for, and Strange Object and Deep Vellum and Jill for allowing this to happen. So I'm gonna read real quick. Sometimes at these launch events, it's really fun. You see everybody you know, and you go like, and there's you, and there's you, and I remember you, and I remember, but I can't do that and kill time to avoid reading. So I'm gonna read very briefly, probably about 5 minutes from the final story in the collection. And then Paul and I are gonna talk about old times or talk about the book. And we'll see where things go, all right? So just to sort of get you ready for this story, it's a spoiler alert. I'm going to read the ending to the last story in the book. It doesn't ruin anything, but I think it gets, hopefully, the tone and the mood across. And so this is a story called The Diver, from the end of it. And what's happened in this story, just to sort of catch you up a little bit, is that there are two stories that there's a family that appears twice in this collection. They open the book in a story called Ghost Story, and they close it in this story. It's called The Diver. The couple is Hannah and Soren. They have 2 young boys. And in this particular story, Soren has spent the evening telling a bedtime story to his kids, and it's gone off the rails. The story has sort of moved to the point where they've invented a hero named the Diver who is fighting this old creature named Old Grimir. He's a big giant squid. The world has flooded, and the boys are going around in a canoe, and their hero, the Diver, has defeated the squid. But in the process, he himself has been destroyed. And the boys are then left to kind of pick up his pieces and move in the canoe to the next part of the world. So that's the story that they've sort of been telling over the course of the night together. Meanwhile, his wife, Hannah, who's been out all day canvassing for environmental causes, has come home, and she's spent the time on the phone with her sister. And so she hasn't been in the room, but has been sort of concluding those things. And I think it hopefully would go sort of without saying, but I should probably say it. They're having a hard time in their marriage. So you'll see how that sort of plays out at the end. So in the room, the boys were quiet. What happened after that? The younger one finally asked. Well, Soren said, the next day, They saw an island in the distance and figured that the diver had somehow led them to it. They began paddling for those dark hills. He wiped his hands on the leg of his pants. He saw that the boys were watching him closely, but he didn't know what else to say. The world was new, that's all, Soren finally said. It was theirs to start. In his mind's eye, he saw the island exactly, a steep volcanic ledge climbing out of the sea. He saw the canoe heading for it, and then the story slipped away. Were their parents there? The younger boy asked. Oh, Soren said, no, not physically. But they visited them in their dreams. They'd been waiting there, and they missed them so much. The air in the bedroom felt suddenly thick, and Soren could tell that neither boy was satisfied with the story. They sensed when things had gone off the rails and knew when he was just trying to wrap things up. But it was late, and he could think of nothing else to say. Good night, he finally announced and stood. He gently pressed the back of his hand to each of their cheeks, walked across the room, and shut the door. In the kitchen, Soren poured himself a drink and began to straighten the counter. There wasn't much to do. Hannah had gotten there first. And suddenly he felt as though he might be sick. He rinsed his cup and set it on the rack. And as he told the story, images of Hannah, photos from her childhood he'd seen years ago, had popped into his mind. And then another old friend who'd been dead for years. He had no idea why. He swept some crumbs from the toaster into his hand, and then he dumped them into the sink. And then he turned out the lights and stood in the darkness. He found Hannah in their bedroom. She was stretched out and lying perfectly still on the floor. It's my back, she said. She had her eyes closed to concentrate on the pain. How'd it go today? Soren asked. Oh, knock, knock, not interested. I must have walked 10 miles. You say climb it and watch the door close. It's depressing. The world's ending and nobody cares. Soren took off his shoes and lay down next to her. Through the thin carpet, he felt the hard wooden floor. Hannah opened her eyes. What's the matter? She asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. No, Soren said. I'm just thinking about something. She reached over and squeezed his hand. This was the time they had together, and she was ready to talk. But whatever it was he wanted to say kept moving away from him like a silver glinting fish. He closed his eyes. Relaxing volume was playing from Hannah's phone on a low. Relaxing music was playing from Hannah's phone on a low volume. He imagined a small blue light pulsing. He imagined diving into his wife's body, crawling down her spine, and looking at a painful spot in her back with a powerful underwater lamp. It really does feel like the world is ending, he finally said, but it can't be. Well, Hannah said, let me tell you about an important election coming up in your district. She stretched inside. The apartment was small, and from his vantage on the floor, Soren could see down the dark hallway. And from under the boys' bedroom door, he saw that one of them had left his bed and was now flicking his light on and off to make his brother laugh. Go to sleep, Hannah called from the floor, not unkindly. He heard a yelp and scampering, and one more stifled laugh, and then they were quiet. I hung up on Chloe, Hannah finally said. She called me hypocritical for bringing children into the world. She said it was selfish, and she could see right through it, and see right through my causes, that they amount to zero in the scheme of things, and they do nothing except make me feel better about myself. Hannah sighed. I've been thinking about this, and it's made me feel like I'm some orbiting planet. I don't recognize, and it's as though I've become some sort of space rover. I've been distant, I've been cruel, I'm the terrible, busy mother and the callous, neglectful sister. She squeezed his hand and let it go. But where have you been? Where you've been is no better. When you're angry, you stay quiet, but the whole apartment feels it, and you're not happy until everyone is as angry as you. That's true, Soren said. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to tell her, Hannah said, because I do think of my children, but they're not the only thing I think about. And I have been selfish. There's so much I want to preserve for them, and one day it's all going to be gone. I love this life. I regret none of it. I just want everything to last a little longer. Outside, the streets were wet, and the temperature was on the verge of dropping. Soren closed his eyes. From down the hall, he heard one of the boys leave his bed again and step quietly across his room to find the light switch. On, off, on again. It flashed under the closed bedroom door like a message. The story was over. But of course, it would also start again, and maybe this time be different. I love you so much, Soren said. And Hannah laughed, a sudden bark, hard and full. He reached for her hand, found it. She curled her fingers around his thumb. On the carpet next to them, her phone began to quake and vibrate like a robot's heart. Don't pick it up, Soren said. I won't, Hannah said. She stretched and yawned. Her eyes were closed too. I wouldn't dream of it. And that's it. The rest of that story has a huge giant squid, but that's sort of the domestic stuff. And that's wrapping it up. And now I'd like to sort of introduce Paul Yoon, who's the
I can't
author.
believe you read the last part of this book. It's like such a spoiler.
Well, you know.
That was beautiful. I'm kidding. Hey, you know what I wanted to ask you? I've been dying to ask you, and you kind of brought it up. Well, first, it's good to see you, E. I haven't seen you in months. But this whole epic, I love it. This whole kind of origin of, starting with, telling your kids stories. How did that even, were they just like, Dad, if you read to me Wind in the Willows one more time, I'm going to scream? Like, how did it even, you know what I mean? Like, how did you make that jump from, or was there no jump at all? Were you always sort of telling them stories, your two boys?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So quickly, before you sort of move too fast, I also want to show you your book. Here's Paul's books. Get Paul's books too. Paul's amazing. But the other thing too is I read that story, Paul, because I sent that story, an early version of that story to you.
Yeah.
And you helped me so much with that particular ending.
I think it had a different title too, right? Or am I mixing that up with something?
Yes, it bounced around. I can't even remember.
This is the thing. We've read each other's drafts so much that I can't even remember the titles of your stories. Yeah. Anyway, that's an aside. Yeah.
Good story number one. Good story number two.
Yeah.
But as for sort of the kids, I mean, that was, so my experience of it was that you as you're sort of putting the kids to bed, and this happened a lot when my wife, when Mary Hope had a job where she had to commute and she was gone for the weekdays.
Right.
So I was putting the boys to bed regularly, and we would read stories, and then they just no longer wanted to hear the stories that we were reading. And so we started making up stories, and they actually sort of started, and I just started asking them questions. And one of the things that I sort of noticed is that they were sort of always going towards danger. They're like, and then what happened? And then what happened? Tell us something sort of scary. And there was a moment where they asked for a scary story, which came right after we were reading Frog and Toad, which I never get sick of Frog and Toad, even if they're like, Dad, any other book, we'll read.
Right.
But there's a story called The Shivers in Frog and Toad that is about trying to kind of scare your friend with a story. And so we made up a lot of stories, we made up a lot of characters together, and none of them were sort of as bleak and sort of awful as some of the stories that are in the book, but that was kind of the genesis there. And there was also that feeling, and I think that we've talked about this a little bit, which is like when you start to tell these stories and you're kind of trapped in the room and it feels like time has just sort of stopped and you're never going to get out of the room and you're just kind of talking to kind of keep things afloat. It just felt like the floor, it was like, it was the weirdest thing. And I would tell the stories on the bed. They had two beds next to each other. And it was like the floor dropped out from under the beds and we were just sort of on our boat together in a very sort of enclosed space. And it just kind of came to haunt me and I liked it. And I started to ask, I was like, what am I trying to do here with these stories? I would try to tell stories that I thought would help them think about how to be in the world. And then they would sort of get bored. And so then I would tell them stories about sort of dangerous things and they would start to perk up. But then if it's too scary, then they won't go to bed. And so you have to find a way sort of out of those stories. And that became...
Yeah. I mean, what's cool about that is you're sort of in the submarine with your boys, kind of crafting these tales, but you busted out of that. You know what I mean? Like you would tuck them into bed and then you went and you went outside those borders and those stories stayed with you. And somehow that became like the domino in terms of like, oh, like I'm going to transform that into like short fiction, you know? And what I love about, and I don't know if this is sort of intentional or not, but there's a deep consistency in these stories in terms of there are many layers, right? Each story has, you know, there's one narrative going on, like you just read, right? From the diver, there's one narrative going on, but there's also another narrative going on. There's Hannah and Soren narrative going on. There's you know, canvassing going on outside the window in their day-to-day life, right? In the first story, we learned that, you know, they want to move and have a bigger place in the city, but they can't afford to do that. There's all this stuff going on. And yet there's also this kind of the narrative of this imagined space, you know?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that was my experience of like young parenthood, where you're just like
Yeah,
everything's going
right.
on at exactly the same time, and you go, I have these sort of very boring things that I have to sort of attend to over here, but if I don't attend to them, everything's good. But plus, there's sort of the glaciers are melting. Plus, there's sort of these other things that are kind of worrying you. And one of the things that ended up happening, and like you write as well, and you know that you are sort of always trying to access that moment where you sort of are looking for depth. That's what you're sort of looking for.
Yeah,
But that moment
that's right.
in kind of like a submergence zone, right, where you go, oh, I'm sort of down here, and it's kind of uncertain. One of the things that I realized with kids is that you would go down to that zone, and just when you got there, you had to sort of come back up to the surface.
Yeah.
And so that what you're talking about, I think, is exactly replicated in the story, where you go, it's surface, depth. And for me, it was also a little bit of like tenderness was sort of layered over sort of danger, if that makes sense. And that's kind of where kind of the tongue. So the story, the act of storytelling to me was the mode of tenderness. And that's where the story is going to sort of demonstrate its tenderness. I'm going to take care of you as I tell you the story. But the story itself is going to hopefully kind of submerge you into a place that isn't
exactly
quite on the surface.
Or, you know, the act of writing or creating or crafting these stories, it's a vertical act for us. You know, it's not we think it's horizontal. It's like A to B to C, but I would actually disagree and say that it's all about kind of like, what can we, like, what are the layers that we can add, you know? I've been thinking a lot about, forgive anyone who's heard this before, like those, you know, wacky Hieronymus Bosch paintings, you know, of that era, where huge canvases, so many things going on, right? People are burning in hell. Someone's like fleeing a village, you know, the sun is shining and the doves are, you know, why, do you have one over there?
Yeah.
See, mind connection. This is why I love you, brother.
I thought I was wearing sweatpants.
Yeah. Were you were, I was afraid you were like in your boxers or something and you forgot.
It could have been a lot worse.
But okay, so like, you know, and you have so much action going on, and they managed to accomplish that in one canvas, right? And how does one, like, why can't we do that on the page? But can we do that? I'm always asking myself, can we do that and not make it feel like we're writing like a Dickensian book? You know what I mean? Like, can we do it in a miniature way? Can you make something feel epic and layered, but also small and intimate, right?
Well, I think that you do it. How do you do it? I mean, my sense is that I've started to think of stories, you're talking about like spheres, and there's different sort of spheres. And one of the things that a story can do is actually sort of move you elegantly through those spheres. So you can't squish everything up on just sort of a flat canvas the way you can as you paint, but you can kind of engineer movement. And one of the ways to sort of get down into that depth is to not engineer movement on, not trying to engineer movement like on the surface level of things, but you're trying to engineer sort of an emotional movement that perhaps has to do with imagery and feeling. And that's how you move through those spheres. But how do you do it? Because your stories in particular have that sense of, they look at something that is so closely that actually the world sort of starts to shimmer, and it's like everything is in that particular moment, if that makes sense. I don't think I've ever been able to do that. I sort of am like, let's blow up a boat and see what happens. But you've always been really wonderful.
I think that's what I do too. I have no idea what I'm doing. But I think you're touching upon, you know, what I definitely feel kinship with is, you know, you rely on the consistency or the repetition of whatever it is that's kind of like sort of bubbling inside of you, whether that's a color, it's a palette, an object, right? And you just kind of trust that if that can be a kind of like through line thread, then maybe that's all it takes to hang your story, on it. You know what I mean? Which made me think of like, for this book I'm glad you brought up like the differences between peripatetic and this, where I think for me, when I think back on peripatetic, and correct me if this is not accurate, but like there was actually sort of a myriad of voices, right, in peripatetic. But the connection and the through line for me was actually that the characters seemed to have like a pretty sort of similar worldview, no matter their situation, no matter how varied, and for this book, the thing that struck me like immediately strongly, even when I was fortunate enough and had the privilege to read the drafts, is the tone was just super consistent. Like the whole book is operating on a tone. You caught a tone and you stayed really disciplined about that. And I wonder if that's, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I wonder if it's just simply because, you are also a musician. And I just wondered if that was you were sort of conscious about kind of thinking about like auditory experience of the book, you know what I mean? Like, and crafting sentences and keeping that tone alive throughout the whole thing.
Yes. That was the number one thing that I was trying to, I was trying to sort of find a collection that to some degree all did sort of look inward and kind of created sort of a sonic resonance that cohesive, right? So even if with these like different parts, it's not necessarily like a worldview that I was sort of trying to kind of put in there. Like we talked about this earlier, that the older we get, the less certain we feel about anything, about how we're supposed to sort of make art, be in the world, be anything. And actually embracing that is kind of a wonderful thing. But
totally.
one of the, but like when I was younger, like that's what I thought. I was like, oh, I know how this works. Now it just sort of became more about sort of grabbing kind of like a melody line or something like that and just staying on it until it kind of began to vibrate and resonate in a weird way. Or in a way that sort of felt pleasing. And the feeling that I was trying to replicate in this book, this is sort of the secret, was the kind of fever dream surface submergence. And then before you know it, those things are they're actually kind of smushing together. In all the stories where there's a frame, you can't actually keep the tenderness and the darkness far apart. They start alternating, and then they just kind of start cohabitating in that particular space. For me, that was the experience of being a parent, where I just sort of had that emotional sort of feeling where everything was just kind of wrapped up into sort of one tightness thing here, right? And that became I don't have anything that I want to tell anybody in this particular book, but I have a very precise feeling that I'm trying to evoke with the story. And that to me does feel like what you're kind of trying to do, what one is trying to do with music, which what I wish I could do with music, but I just don't have it.
That you're being very modest about that. But so another thing that's, really interesting about this book is that you have the frame, right? You have the Hannah and Soren stories at the beginning. So you start with Hannah and Soren, and then what you read is the ending, right? So you're framing the whole book with these two. And again, it's almost like you start in that kind of like submarine. The book itself starts in that kind of submarine, right? And then it kind of takes off, right? And then goes into sort of, amazing adventures, and then comes back at the end. Was that, again, like just, obviously we don't know anything. So maybe this was not an intention, but did you sort of feel like that was always going to be like how you sort of shaped this book? Like, was that always there?
Oh,
and you know what I mean? Like those two stories, and then it was just a question about the journey and then coming back, or was that kind of like a surprise?
It was a total surprise.
Oh, wow.
Then,
Okay, cool. Yeah.
But then once it was there,
Yeah.
it was like, oh, we need, so the frame stories, I just liked how it was working for me. There's something about the frame that really allowed me to access very quickly all of the things that I wanted to get into a story. But without getting too far into the trap of plot, because the plot is really, I'm just going to tell you a story, and you can interrupt and you can pull things out and sort of highlight, and you can have people comment. And I like that mode of storytelling. The book, though, for me, belongs to Hannah and Soren. And I was having a problem with that last story. And it was because I had named the characters something else to try to kind of hide the fact that they were versions of Hannah and Soren. And then I was like, it just doesn't have the resonance that I was looking for. And I was like, well, here you go with the name. And it's like in sort of music, when you just go like, oh, let's try that on the downbeat. And you go like, oh, that's it. That's how it has to be. And then as soon as there were two stories that you visited them early, sort of in their life when sort of things were working one way, and then a little bit later, after there had been some sort of like there's mileage, you go, oh, there's actually a lot of distance between these two particular experiences. So even though the stories mimic the shape with the same sort of characters, they're continuing sort of a conversation. And it was what I liked about that is that it actually made this collection feel like a book, like a book, a whole collected, linked book, without actually explicitly linking every single piece. We're like, oh,
right.
in this other part of Maine, elsewhere in Maine, it was just like they were inhabiting the emotional sphere that I was trying to get across. And I was just so happy that they opened the book and sort of closed it, like a frame itself.
Totally. Again, not concerned about A to B to C, you know what I mean? But like if we have a canvas, like how do we create that Boschi, multi-layered experience, right? And we've talked about, our favorite story collections are the ones that sort of feel less like a collection of stories that have kind of a higher vision, if that's what you want to call it, Murakami's After the Quake is one that we often talk about that does that beautifully, right? But one thing that I loved about what you said about kind of, just thinking about like once you had that frame going on those journeys, this book is all about these sort of, they're really epic journeys. Each story has a really epic, and I mean that like in like a heart, like they're just like, there's a lot of just sort of heartfelt, epic, sad, but joyful, funny, like it's just a whole lot of, things going on in terms of like experience, right? That those characters go through. And yet what I loved about each story is that the journey never ends where I think it was going to end, like Farthest South title story, not going to give anything away, but you think you're like on a sea voyage, and like, hell no, you are, you know what I mean? Like there's just something completely like shifts, right? Even like Holiday, right? Which is, like a kind of, oh, you think we're going to follow a couple, to an English seaside town, and then you realize there's like another story there, there's like another journey going on. And I just thought, it's not really a question. I just thought it was just so beautifully done, that kind of subverting of our readers' expectations. And again, that was just another way to add these sort of beautiful layers and surprises to this book.
Oh, Paul, thank you. You're the best.
Yeah.
And I actually would love to talk to you about, because endings, I thought a lot about the endings in this particular book. And the only way that I sort of came to think about it was that when I was trying to write endings that were kind of doing the narrowing down, where you're like, well, this is where it was always going to go, and doing what you've been taught to do, which is it's supposed to be surprising and inevitable. It just started to feel like the story knew itself too much, which was the exact opposite of the feeling that I was trying to get across, which was that, like, let's just sort of try to get a little bit closer to that uncertainty. And one of the things that I was thinking about with these one of the ways that the story was built, not to get like these stories were built, not to get like too nerdy about it, but I was just thinking, you were talking about journeys, and I was thinking a lot about arrivals and departures. And then I was also thinking about the ways in which sort of stories, which are all interruptions. And I started to think about movement on the story level having to do with stories interrupting each other. And so nothing sort of quite comes to the close that you're expecting, because somebody's going to come in and start telling another story, and then start sort of telling another story. Lauren Groff, I just heard her talk, and she had this really wonderful way of distilling what dialogue is. And I've always had a hard time explaining to students like what dialogue is supposed to be. It just takes me like 3 class periods, and then they go like, forget it.
Semester's already over.
Yeah, I was like, well, all right, turning your final portfolios. But she said, remember, dialogue is always power. And I was like, oh, and for some reason that really clicked. And the way that sort of telling story, so someone tells a story, and then in every ending here, somebody else comes in right at the end to kind of snatch it away, to begin to tell sort of a different story about either what you've sort of seen, and you almost gave the ending of that story away.
I did. Well, you already read the last few pages of the book, so.
I know, at least in this particular book, like the body count in Peripatetic Coffin was like 176.
That's right, less body count here. Yeah.
Less body count. So I'm getting better, I'm getting more humane. But
I think this book's scarier though.
I hope so. It was scary.
I think it's terrifying. Yeah.
It also felt like it felt less of a performance and just much more personal.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's what I was sort of trying to get at, in terms of like, I was just so impressed by the consistency of tone that it just felt, it felt like, it just felt true. You know, you're reading it and it's like, this is the true identity of this book. And the tone is so kind of beautifully consistent. It just felt true. But I do want to, I think we're closing in on time for audience Q&A. If people want to, ask things, but I did want to quickly ask you one question. And I don't even know if you have an answer to this, but we have been sharing our work for almost 2 decades now, which is unbelievable to me. And I just wondered, like, do you remember your writer self like 19 years ago? And has your sort of point of view or perspective about making art changed at all, like in these past 19 years? No pressure. Again, like it was just something I was thinking about today, just because I was thinking about how long we've known each other. Yeah.
Paul, like that is, yes, absolutely. But it's such a really interesting question, and it's impossible for me to sort of take that apart, though, honestly, without thinking about you and the way that we've had that friendship, and have sort of shaped each other's work. I don't understand the writer that I was like when we started, and I don't understand where the desire to write came from.
Right.
We was just smoke as many cigarettes as possible. It was just great.
Right.
But yeah. I don't think that I had any sense of what I was trying to do. And it's just been like a really long process to sort of figure that out. But it's been a pleasure and a joy the whole time. And part of it, one of the things that people sort of say about sort of like writing is that it's so solitary and isolating and lonely. And like, that's also like my wheelhouse. But
totally, yeah.
But it's really not. It's a form of communication. And one of the things that has really kept me going is knowing that I could always sort of send you work. Have you?
Yeah, likewise, yeah.
Well, I mean, how would you answer that question? And then I'm going to show you something that is going to make you laugh.
I have no idea how to answer that question. I mean, the thing that stayed consistent, I think, is that I quickly realized, and maybe because we were kind of sharing stories and we were writing together, how much work writing entails.
Yeah. Like,
just like the sheer labor of it, and how to go about that, like how to create the discipline, how to, like, where does inspiration come from? Like when you hit a wall, does that mean like you just like, it's just done, there's no more inspiration? You know what I mean? And so, like thinking about all that stuff, but ultimately just putting in the work. I feel like that's something that stayed consistent for me, I think.
Yeah, and then the work has sort of become your life.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Not in like an obliterating way, but you just go, this is just, and it's hard to, I don't think that I could have explained that to myself as a younger person. It just sort of seemed like, oh, you do this and then this happens. And you go like, no, it's a practice and it's a joy. And you just kind of you'll never come to the end of the road because you enjoy the practice of it, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Raluca has just said 19 years. And you're like, and that's right. We met when we were 10. We're now 29 years old.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Holy shit.
You can't
That's
say
incredible.
that. You can't swear on YouTube.
Yes,
So anyway, Paul, that's my present to you. That's a picture. That's a picture of me and Paul. Like, I don't know. We were
22.
Yeah, when we were sort
It
of.
must have been 22.
I think we were cooking.
Is that Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think, and this is we're cooking Jill Myers a birthday cake because it's her birthday.
That's right. Happy birthday, Jill. We love you, Jill.
Yeah. So
all right. So that was amazing. That just totally made my night. You have to send me that photo. But I'm gonna swing it over to James, who's gonna facilitate some audience Q&A.
Thanks. That was great. We're going to require all authors to provide photos like that, I think, for these events. That's awesome. That's a great finish.
I love it.
That's really fantastic. I'll throw in some, the first thing I'll share here is just a comment about how, from Hillary, about how the description of the tension in parenthood between managing the tenderness and the darkness and how they eventually have to coexist, being perfect and heartbreaking. Which is true. I think I hadn't thought about it too much until you mentioned it, Ethan, but yeah, having this undercurrent of dread, if that's the right word, that has to do with being a parent, this like constant low level fear, which is a part of it that people don't talk about it too much, like is there in the book and makes it very powerful. And it's kind of nice to acknowledge it, like that we just live our lives and most of the time it's fine, but always with this sense that there's a hole underneath that could open up at any point.
Yeah. The last 4 years, you go like, everything's fine. You're like, oh, there's a portal to hell right over there.
Right.
But I mean, thank you. That's such a nice thing to say, Hillary and James. I mean, my other sense too is, what I found that I was doing as a parent was trying to separate those two things, like particularly when they were young, where you just go sort of like, nope, life is only tenderness and I'll take care of the darkness. And then it just, as they sort of get older, you realize that actually being a good parent to some degree is modeling how those things sort of coexist, and not pretending that it isn't there.
Yeah. Question here from Brett. Well, who first of all says to Paul how much he's liked your books and how Snow Hunters in particular was a guardian angel book for him the year it came out, and that he still opens it up at least once a year. He does recommend both of your books, by the way. But he asks how, if you could speak to the pandemic's influence on this collection.
Yeah, so I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. So a lot of these stories were written before the pandemic. And Jill and I were working together right before the pandemic. But we actually edited the book. We did all of the work on the book once the pandemic had hit. And so we were editing and writing and corresponding, going back and forth, but also checking in on each other. So like, what's it like down in Texas? What's it like up here? And it was just this very weird thing where a lot of the anxiety that was in the book it almost felt like it was starting to kind of break its bonds and sort of be reflected like in the world, right? The book, a lot of the stories in the book are about what happens as sort of these big external things kind of like start to collapse. What happens when you sort of are kind of like, I mean, there is a version of these stories that you go like, oh, these are trapped in the house stories. You can't go anywhere, you're a parent. And it was very strange to watch that kind of literalization. And so, but one of the things that I'll always remember about this book was that we did all of the edits and put it together over the course of the sort of the virus, and under sort of that threat. And I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if one of the things that Paul is sort of, that we were talking about, which is that kind of like weird humming, that kind of consistent sort of humming dread that's there. I'm not entirely sure that was there in the early versions of the book. And that may have sort of been kind of put in there as we went through and sort of sanded things down and started to find kind of new energies in there.
A question here from Edward, who wonders what books you were reading when you were writing these stories, and asks who or what you see yourself in conversation with. Was it books? Was it TV, music, etc.?
Oh, he said no friendo. That's code for, we used to play Nintendo together, and his wife called it, oh, you guys are gonna go play the no friendo, huh? Which is the title of my next collection, No Fredzo. Listen, that's a lovely question. As I was reading it, like, quite honestly, it was the Frog and Toad stories. Like, and it sounds silly to say this, the Frog and Toad stories, I think, are kind of like the beating pulse of these books, because at the end of Frog and Toad, they sort of have these like adventures and they sort of move towards sort of danger. But then at the end, they kind of have a moment of sort of tenderness, and you know that something else is going to come next, but they kind of stop and they sit by the fire. And I love the endings for those particular books. I also really loved Dennis. I mean, I've always loved Dennis Johnson, but the collection, The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, he's a writer who actually does have people who just kind of come in and start telling stories, and they just kind of take over the narrative. And I think that that movement was there. Paul and I mentioned Haruki Murakami, who I've loved for a long time. But then also this other book that Paul gave me, which this is Rock Crystal by Adalbert Stifter. And it's just a weird old book, but it's beautiful. And the entire story is about sort of children. They are trying to cross a mountain and they get into danger, and then they sort of get out of it. And what I loved about it, I found it so moving, and I wept. It's like 97 pages. I was just crying. And I was like, how did something that was so sort of simple in its telling become so beautiful? And that became the kind of thing that I was trying to do, take a very simple story and just kind of twerk it in these weird ways.
Ethan, I think we were talking a bit about Mrs. Caliban when you were writing your stories too, right? The Rachel Ingalls novel, right? Which is part of your epigraph, I think, in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm going to stop being the guy who's just like, I have it right here. I have it right here. But I do have it right here. Yes, Mrs. Caliban actually probably was the book that was like, oh, I didn't know you could do this. Like, I love Mrs. Caliban by Rachel Ingalls. And it's a different kind of book, but it is one that puts the sort of the domestic sphere up against sort of the monstrous.
Right.
And the sea monster sort of comes in and becomes the expression of desire. And I just love it. I love this. Her sentences are simple. It's a riotously like funny book. It's also merciless in sort of how it just sort of turns corners. So I think actually you're right, Paul. That would be the number one influence, would be Mrs. Caliban, which I would recommend. That's the only book that I've bought in the last like 5 years, where I bought 6 copies of it. I couldn't, and they were sort of hard to find. I just gave them to everybody. I love that book.
Okay. We've got just a couple more. I think we have time for both. Let's see, Christopher says, hello, Ethan. I don't know if you remember me, but you were one of my mentors at the Loft Literary Center when you were in Minnesota about 10 years ago. Congrats on the book. Question is this: can you tell what is the phrase and or sentence that you feel most proud of in the book? And how did you come up with that? Do you have one darling that you did not kill?
No, I kill all my darlings. Chris, it's so wonderful to hear. This makes me so happy. I wish we were sort of on the same room. I'm just like, it's so great to hear from you. I hope you're still writing. I think about your book actually quite regularly. Yes, I actually do have, but I'm not going to be able to remember it. But there's a description of a painting of ships that's supposed to be comforting, and in a hospital where the parents have their child who has these gills, and there's these hospital people coming in, and it's all sort of very frightening. And the art is supposed to calm them down. And it was just a picture of fat ships on a placid sea. No, Fat Ships and a Cult. Well, I've screwed it up, but that's what
Because
it
you're
was.
a writer, not a talker. That's how that you
Yeah,
tend to get it right on
exactly.
the page.
Read the book. They're all great sentences. You can buy it for.
There's one last one here, which is a fairly specific one from David, asking, in the rest of the story, The Diver, do we see images from the stories inside the imagination of the boys? The one image we get in the selection you read, The Island, comes to us as Soren sees it in his own mind. Do we see in their imagination, or do we stay inside Soren as the story is told?
So in the frame, that's a great question. I mean, in the frame version, it's Soren who has sort of has access to this. But when it actually goes down into the depth of the story itself, it moves into sort of narrative time, and the story actually exists. It's the boy's imagination that is moving that through. So Soren, I mean, technically Soren is the one who's telling all of these things, but the boys take over the understory, and then he's sort of the one who pulls it out.
Got it. And you can find out all the details of that in the stories when you buy the book, as many of you have already done, and the rest of you surely will. You can hop over to those links and do that. There it is again. Good work.
Thank you guys. Thank you everybody for coming. This has made me so happy, even though I can't see you. Paul, my greatest friend in the world, I love you. Thank you so much for doing
Love you,
this.
brother.
James, thank you for having us. Everybody who came, everybody who put these questions in, this is the very best. Someone just says they like my sweater. Thank you very much. I like the sweater too. But I do want to go back very quickly before we go off into sort of good night and say, please support your local independent bookstores. A book like this does not exist without independent publishing, small publishing houses, without independent bookstores. So if you love me at all, even if you've already bought a copy of this book, please seek out your independent bookstore and buy Paul's books or Mrs. Caliban, or even better, go talk to somebody who's working there and say, what have you been reading that has like blown the back of your head off? Those are always the conversations that are really wonderful, and it'll put you into unexpected places. So thank you all very much for coming.
Well, thank you guys. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.